But the room shifts when Crockett lays out photos and sworn testimony from those left behind in the race for innovation. The hearing chamber freezes, senators stunned, the audience breathless, as the world's most powerful CEO is forced to face voices he tried to silence. If Elon Musk can build rockets to Mars, why can't he build a future that includes dignity on Earth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted ceiling of the Rayburn House office building, Room 311 buzzed with quiet tension as national networks cut to a live feed. It was supposed to be a routine congressional hearing, an inquiry into labor conditions at Tesla's sprawling factories in Texas, Nevada, and California. The room was filled with the usual suspects, lawyers in Navy suits, aides scribbling notes, and members of the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections seated in a semicircle behind nameplates. But before the chair could strike the gavel, a ripple of murmurs broke out. The heavy oak door opened. In walked Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, unexpected, unannounced, and very much out of place. Her name hadn't been on the official schedule. She was stepping in for a Democratic colleague who had suddenly withdrawn due to medical complications. But the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Camera lenses snapped toward her, but just as the chamber had begun to steady under the force of Jasmine Crockett's silent arrival, the atmosphere shifted again, this time with a colder gravity. The doors opened not for justice, but for dominance, cloaked in the quiet arrogance of wealth that no longer needed permission to be heard. Elon Musk stepped into the hearing room as if it were merely another launch bay, one more platform from which to propel his legend. He didn't walk like a man entering federal scrutiny. He walked like someone arriving to reclaim his narrative. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, his pace was slow enough to suggest control, but fast enough to signal impatience with ceremony. His suit was understated, but flawless. His tie the same storm gray shade as the Tesla Gigafactory rooftops. Even the small Tesla emblem on his lapel caught the overhead lights like a signature. He offered no glances to the press pool, no nods to the committee. His only acknowledgement was a calculated pause at the witness chair, a second's delay that said, "This isn't your moment, it's mine." Then he sat, fluid, centered, utterly undisturbed, his fingers unfurled beside the microphone, as if no one else in the room had ever had anything worth saying. He leaned forward before anyone could even address him, adjusting the mic with the casual precision of a man used to commanding satellites, rockets, and boardrooms. "Let me save us all some time," he began, his tone soft but fortified. "Tesla is not your enemy. Tesla is the future of the United States economy." He didn't blink, didn't breathe between lines. "While others regulate and litigate, we innovate. While Washington squabbles over policy, we build the next generation of American dominance." The words weren't statements, they were proclamations, dropped with the confidence of someone who had seen regulators come and go, but had never been caged by one. He dismissed the hearing itself with a single sweeping gesture. These allegations, manufactured by media outlets desperate for relevance, fueled by the far-left factions who despise anything they can't control. This isn't about labor conditions, it's about political theater. It's about punishing ambition. And with that, he leaned back, not in retreat, but in satisfaction. Every word was a shield, every sentence a weapon. He wasn't defending Tesla. He was elevating it, transforming accusations of human harm into accusations against his accusers. He invoked freedom, innovation, American values as if they were patents he already owned. The factory injuries, the racial discrimination lawsuits, the suicide attempt on the Fremont floor. Left unaddressed, unspoken, strategically erased. In their place, Musk projected an illusion of greatness so blinding that anyone who dared question it could be dismissed as anti-progress. And therein lay the injustice, because across the table sat Jasmine Crockett, the only voice in that room explicitly chosen not by wealth or Wall Street, but by people who'd been ignored by both. And now she was being told, before she could speak a single word, that this hearing, this process, this country's attempt at accountability was a waste of his time. The cameras didn't blink. The world didn't turn away. But in that moment, power made itself known, not just in Elon Musk's words, but in the quiet certainty behind them. That in America, Even under oath, a billionaire can still talk louder than the truth. As Elon Musk settled deeper into his chair, cloaked in the illusion of control he had so confidently wrapped around the room, a quiet shift occurred, not in volume, but in intent. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not to match his power, but to dismantle it. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The calm precision in her tone carried more weight than any gavel. "Mr. Musk," she began, her words measured like a prosecutor reading an indictment, "Tesla's internal injury reports from your Fremont and Austin plants show numbers that don't align with the federal records you submitted. Specifically, in the last 14 months, your reported OSHA figures list 43 non-serious incidents. Yet internal Tesla files, which I now have before me, show over 130 injury logs marked serious or urgent, most of which were never disclosed to federal safety regulators." She paused only long enough for her words to settle in the room, like dust after an explosion. "Can you explain the cause of this discrepancy?" she asked. "Or should we assume that compliance, like your tweets, is optional in your world?" There was a long beat of silence, the kind that says more than any rebuttal. Musk's eyes narrowed, but his lips twitched into a controlled, amused curve. And then he laughed, quietly, dismissively, like a man listening to a question from someone he'd already decided didn't belong in the room. The smirk came next, followed by the soft, deliberate clearing of his throat. "Congresswoman," he said, dragging the title out like it was too heavy for her to carry, "with all due respect, and I use that term generously, you clearly don't understand the complexities of industrial-scale production." He leaned back, folding his arms like a teacher correcting a student who dared question the curriculum. "Minor injuries happen in any large operation, but perhaps instead of chasing clickbait numbers, we could focus on actual innovation." It wasn't just an evasion, it was an erasure. He hadn't offered data. He hadn't refuted her claim. He had chosen to reduce her, to belittle not only her question, but her right to ask it. In that moment, he didn't see a public servant confronting a corporate giant. He saw a nuisance to swat away, a soundbite to outmaneuver. The injustice was almost surgical. The room had been asked to believe that power made a man more credible and that intelligence wore a suit and smirk, not a voice that carried the weight of the unseen and unheard. But Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't flinch or fold. She simply held the silence like a blade, letting the world see exactly what arrogance looked like when it was caught mid-sentence. And as the weight of Musk's condescension still hung in the air, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She simply opened the folder in front of her, as if revealing not just documents, but an autopsy report on the very system that had allowed a billionaire to laugh in the face of human suffering. The room shifted before she even spoke again. Not physically, but in temperature, in silence, in the sheer shift of attention that only comes when someone stops playing defense and begins unveiling truth. Jasmine Crockett drew out a stack of printed reports, tabbed and annotated with brutal precision. There was nothing performative in the way she held the pages. Only purpose, razor sharp and honed over months of investigation. She looked up, calm and unshaken, then slid the first document across the polished wood of the hearing table, stopping it directly in front of Elon Musk with the steadiness of a prosecutor delivering Exhibit A. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice crisp, "since you seem unfamiliar with the realities on your own factory floor, allow me to walk you through them." She paused, letting the room quiet itself again. No one moved. Even the stenographer had slowed, sensing the atmosphere becoming something heavier than routine procedure. "This is a Tesla internal injury log from the Fremont plant," she continued, her tone surgical, "compiled from supervisor reports over the last 14 months. It was never submitted to OSHA, never disclosed to investors, and until this moment, never seen outside your executive circle." She held up the next page. 79 cases of serious injury, not minor sprains or fatigue. I'm talking about skull fractures, third-degree burns, spinal compression injuries, names, dates, shift hours, medical outcomes, all filed, all marked, and most damning of all, flagged not to report. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her cadence was calm, deliberate, made even more powerful by its restraint. Page 6, she said, flipping the document toward the committee members as aides scrambled to replicate copies, contains a summary email from a night shift operations manager instructing that injuries resulting in hospital transport should be internally resolved and not escalated unless legal action is imminent. Crockett's eyes locked on Musk, who sat motionless, only the tightening of his jaw betraying his discomfort. Page 11 is a photo of a 19-year-old worker who lost the tip of his index finger operating an unshielded hydraulic press. His medical intake form is time-stamped 3:14 a.m. Your internal log lists this as minor abrasion. The chamber had gone utterly silent. No gavel, no whispers, just the low building pulse of tension as reality began to erode the facade Musk had constructed. Crockett reached into the folder again. This, she said, lifting a high-resolution color printout, is the photo taken at the scene. Blood pooled beneath the machine, a discarded glove visible near the floor panel, taken by a fellow employee who was fired 2 days later after speaking to a shift supervisor about what he witnessed. The air inside the room turned heavier, as if oxygen itself were holding its breath. Musk shifted, just slightly. His fingers pressed against the edge of the table. His previously relaxed posture began to fold in, shoulders stiffer, eyes narrowing not in arrogance now, but in calculation. He opened his mouth once, then paused. When he did speak, the confidence had been chipped. I'm not aware of this particular log, he said, voice quieter now, noticeably strained. It's possible that these figures, some of them, came from third-party contractors, or perhaps internal classification errors. With operations this large, some misalignment in reporting is expected. Crockett didn't interrupt. She let the words hang, weak, meandering, devoid of substance, and then followed them with the precision of a scalpel. Expected, Mr. Musk, she repeated, her tone still composed, but her words now carried a sharper edge. Is it expected that a billion-dollar corporation misclassifies hospitalizations as bruises? Is it expected that supervisors use private email chains to advise staff not to call ambulances during night shifts unless there's a death? She held up another document, because here on page 19 is precisely that language. Avoid ER calls on weekend shifts. They attract unnecessary attention from state safety boards. That's your company policy. That's your culture. That is what Tesla is, not the future of America, but a present built on silencing the injuries that power your quarterly gains. For the first time since entering the room, Elon Musk looked cornered, not by rhetoric, not by outrage, but by facts he couldn't edit, delete, or spin. The room, once his stage, had become his cross-examination. Behind him, aides began to murmur. Someone passed a note discreetly to his chief counsel. But none of it mattered. The myth had cracked, and in its place, the audience now saw a man, not a marvel, a CEO who claimed to build the future, but couldn't account for the blood on the floor of his factories. Jasmine Crockett sat still, not triumphant, but resolute. Her voice hadn't risen once, and yet somehow it had broken through where millions of voices had not. In that moment, the injustice was no longer abstract. It had names, it had timestamps, it had photos, and it had a witness who refused to let power erase the truth. The wounds had been shown, the blood, the broken bones, the silence. But now Jasmine Crockett turned the spotlight towards something colder, less visible, more insidious. It wasn't just about who got hurt. It was about who never got the chance to rise. She reached back into the folder with the same calm gravity as before. But this time, what she pulled out wasn't about bruises or burns. It was about control, suppression. The invisible lines drawn within factory walls that separated one group of workers from another. Lines never written into any official policy, yet deeply etched into lived experience. Mr. Musk, she began, her tone steady but razor-sharp. The injuries we've discussed are a tragedy. But what I have here, she raised a stapled document bearing Tesla letterhead and the subject line, personnel monitoring, tier classifications, reveals something far uglier than negligence. It reveals intent. The page trembled slightly under the overhead lights as she held it up. This is an internal communication from Tesla's Fremont HR department, dated March 3rd. It outlines what's referred to in your own system as a Tier 3 employee watch list. She let the phrase hang there, the weight of it anchoring the room. This list includes names, ethnic background, country of origin, and behavior assessments. Most notably, references to employees deemed resistant to productivity directives or showing signs of collectivist leanings. She lowered the page slightly, eyes locking on Musk like crosshairs. Do you deny that such a system existed under your watch? He didn't answer, not immediately. So she pressed forward, the pace deliberate and suffocating. Because according to this document, over 70% of the individuals flagged under this so-called Tier 3 designation were Black or Latino. Nearly half were first-generation immigrants. Many had spotless performance reviews, but they were still marked. Her hand moved to the second page. And here, this is an email dated April 7th, written by a regional plant manager. It reads, Tier 3 profiles should not be assigned to the AI calibration wing or the robotics learning modules. Too much risk in giving certain individuals advanced system access. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every syllable was a blade. The injustice wasn't just in the content, it was in the calmness of how it had been written. The clinical phrasing, the corporate vocabulary that reduced living, breathing workers into liabilities and threats. This wasn't a rogue manager, Crockett continued. The distribution list on that email includes 3 HR leads and 2 directors of operations. The policy was known. The language was repeated across multiple memos. And nowhere is there a correction. No objection, no audit. Just a quiet sorting system that ensured only certain bodies, certain accents, certain faces would ever stand near your highest levels of innovation. For the first time, Elon Musk didn't smirk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lean back or forward. He simply sat, still, jaw locked, eyes focused on something invisible beyond the chamber. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was calculation. But whatever it was, the armor was cracking. Would you like to tell us, Mr. Musk, Crockett said, her tone now colder than steel, how a company that claims to be building the future of humanity justifies a policy that treats Black and brown workers as a security threat to its machines? The room remained silent, but it was no longer neutral. Even the most loyal eyes on the committee couldn't hide their discomfort. Crockett leaned forward slightly, voice now just above a whisper, but somehow louder than any shout. Or are we to assume, Mr. Musk, that when you say the future belongs to the bold, you really mean it only belongs to those who look like you? She didn't blink. She didn't move. And in that moment, neither did the country watching from behind millions of screens, because the myth of meritocracy had been laid bare. Not with fury, but with fact. Cold, controlled, and unshakable. The evidence of discrimination had landed like a thunderclap, sharp, undeniable, and cold. But power never folds in silence. It roars. And as Jasmine Crockett's calm exposed the fault lines beneath the polished image of Tesla, Elon Musk did what empires often do when threatened. He exploded. His voice cut through the thick silence like a blade. Gone was the composed, strategic CEO who had charmed investors and dazzled tech conferences. In his place was a man cornered by facts he couldn't bend and a woman he couldn't intimidate. Musk's hands slammed flat against the polished wood of the hearing table. Not hard enough to draw a reprimand, but forceful enough to send a tremor through the microphones. This is a smear campaign, he barked, eyes narrowing at Crockett, the measured cadence of his earlier statements replaced by raw emotion. You're twisting confidential documents and making reckless, defamatory accusations. This is not how reality works. You want to talk about racism? Let's talk about facts. He leaned forward, almost over the mic now, as if proximity could make his words more truthful. Tesla's leadership team includes executives from multiple racial and cultural backgrounds. I've personally hired Black engineers. I've promoted Latino project leads. One of our board advisors was raised in a refugee camp. But you don't mention that, do you? His voice rose again, volume overtaking reason. because it doesn't fit the narrative you're trying to force-feed this hearing or the country. Without being asked, he reached into his prepared notes and held up a printed statement, waving it like a shield. $200 million, he said. That's how much we've invested into STEM education programs targeted specifically at underrepresented communities. $200 million. The words hit the room with the velocity of missiles, but they lacked precision. Thousands of kids from low-income neighborhoods, Black, Latino, Native, have been given the tools to build their future because of what Tesla made possible. You think we're the enemy? We're the ones building the solution. A murmur stirred among some of the Republican members at the far end of the bench. One senator tilted his head and gave an approving nod. Another leaned back with his arms crossed, glancing toward Crockett with faint disdain, as if to say, "Now what?" The energy shifted, not in a wave but in a ripple, subtle and political. A billionaire, passionate and cornered, defending his legacy with a voice loud enough to shake the walls. And for a moment, for just a moment, it worked. Sympathy flickered in the air, not because Musk had proved innocence, but because he was powerful, and powerful men so rarely had to defend themselves. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice to meet his. Her posture was unmoved, her hands neatly folded, her gaze locked on him like a surgeon assessing a patient's final, futile resistance. Because what Musk had just done wasn't a defense. It was a tactic, an attempt to drown fact with fury, to rewrite evidence with emotion, to trade guilt for volume. She had seen this play before. So had America. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was warning. Musk's breathing had changed. His voice, still defiant, was beginning to strain at the edges. "You don't get to stand there and act like we're the bad guys," he snapped. "We're solving the problems this committee has debated for decades. We're putting EVs on the road. We're hiring thousands of workers, tens of thousands. Do you know how many of them are first-generation Americans?" He didn't wait for a response. "You're cherry-picking memos, twisting words, and you're doing it for a soundbite. Because that's what this is, right? Theater." The word lingered, ironically, as he gestured wildly. A man unraveling, not because he was guilty of one moment, but because he had built his world on the belief that power was a shield. Now that shield was cracking, and even as a few committee members nodded along, even as he raised his voice and waved the STEM investment like a golden ticket, the room had changed. The public wasn't watching a visionary anymore. They were watching a man threatened by truth and doing everything he could to escape it. Jasmine hadn't spoken in minutes. She didn't need to, because while Musk stormed, while his voice climbed higher and his justifications grew broader, the documents she had laid before the committee were still there, still real, still bleeding truth into the record. What Musk had offered was noise. What Crockett had delivered was evidence. And though some tried to look away, tried to shift the narrative back toward comfort, back toward power, back toward the myth of the benevolent billionaire, the truth remained. He had raised his voice. She hadn't. He had shouted his resume. She had submitted receipts. He had demanded respect. She had earned it. And in that moment, with cameras rolling, mics hot, and 12 million viewers watching from across the country, the balance of power didn't rest with the man who yelled loudest. It rested with the woman who had dared to confront him and hadn't moved an inch. The room had already endured accusations, fury, and the echoing weight of truth. But what came next wasn't noise. It wasn't data. It was the brutal stillness of a reality no billionaire could erase. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised her finger, pressed play, and let the evidence speak. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind the committee desk came alive with a blinking timestamp. Tesla Fremont, internal surveillance, Bay 12, 10:38 p.m. The footage was monochrome, the angle wide, elevated from a ceiling corner like a watchful, indifferent eye. Machinery filled the frame, conveyor belts, mechanical arms, and the cold rhythm of automation. At first, the scene appeared ordinary. A woman, mid-30s, identifiable only by her reflective vest and tired gait, moved through the frame carrying a clipboard. Then, like a string snapping under too much pressure, she collapsed. Her legs folded beneath her. The clipboard skidded across the floor. Her body landed hard. No one came. What followed wasn't an emergency response. It was absence. The woman lay there, still as concrete, for 10 minutes. Then 30. At 11:16 p.m., a forklift passed within 3 feet of her motionless body. The driver didn't stop. At 12:03 a.m., two workers walked by chatting, one briefly glancing down, then walking on as if she were a misplaced jacket. The production line never paused. Machines worked. Screens blinked. Time passed. 1:41 a.m. 2:12 a.m. At 2:53 a.m., a janitor finally knelt down beside her. A shaky radio call. A single nod. But no sense of urgency. No siren. No medical team rushing in. 4 hours and 12 minutes of corporate silence. As the footage faded, a second video immediately followed. This one was raw, intimate. A handheld phone recording. Maria Reyes, the woman from the floor, now sat upright in a modest living room. Her hair was pulled back, her posture slumped forward. The exhaustion in her eyes was something no high-definition lens could soften. She spoke in Spanish, her voice slow, deliberate, painfully steady. "I didn't scream," she said, "because they told us screaming was a sign of weakness. I thought someone would notice. They didn't. They always say, we are part of something big. But I was alone. For 4 hours I was invisible." Her fingers twisted a tissue in her lap, not from nerves but as if holding it was the only thing reminding her she still had hands to use. "We are machines to them. If we break, they leave us. If we bleed, they call it inconvenience. I wasn't a woman in that factory. I was a tool that failed." The video ended not with music or fade out, but with a still shot of Maria, looking straight into the camera, eyes hollow and defiant. The screen went black, and then came the silence. A silence that didn't come from uncertainty, but from recognition. A truth too brutal for rebuttal. Not a soul moved. One senator adjusted his tie, then stopped halfway, his hand frozen near his throat. Another, a man who had earlier muttered support during Musk's fiery defense, removed his translation earpiece and set it on the table like it weighed more than gold. No one asked for clarification. No one objected, because in that moment, no one could. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes not on Musk, not on the screen, but straight ahead, unshaken. She had said nothing since the video began, and yet her voice was everywhere, in Maria's fall, in every tick of the timestamp, in every second that passed without a helping hand. What she delivered wasn't a question, it wasn't a theory, it was a reckoning. A direct confrontation not with policy, but with conscience. This wasn't a labor statistic. It wasn't a partisan stunt. It was one woman left on the floor of a billion-dollar empire, and a nation watching, finally forced to ask why. The chamber still throbbed with the ghost of Maria Reyes' testimony, a silence so dense it choked even the air. But for men who've never been held accountable, silence is intolerable. And so, Elon Musk did what billionaires do when the truth draws blood. He struck back, loud, fast, and personal. He surged forward like a man flung out of orbit, no longer bound by decorum or calculation. "This hearing is a sham," he spat, his voice no longer firm but feral. "This isn't about workers, it's about you." He pointed sharply at Jasmine Crockett, not with the civility of disagreement, but with the venom of accusation. "You stand there acting like some righteous crusader for justice, but you're not fooling anyone. You're a hypocrite wrapped in outrage, financed by far-left tech-hating interest groups that don't give a damn about factories or the people in them." The temperature of the room dropped, not from chill, but from impact. Musk was no longer defending Tesla. He was trying to demolish the credibility of the one woman in the room who had refused to bow. He didn't stop. "Let's not pretend your hands are clean," he barked. "You've taken campaign money from political committees that have openly advocated for dismantling private enterprise. Your name is attached to bills that would cripple innovation. And now here you are, grandstanding, cherry-picking memos, playing edited footage like it's a courtroom drama. You're not here for truth. You're here for clicks." His voice cracked on the last word. Not from weakness, but from force. He had leaned so hard into the mic, it distorted. You're building your career on trying to destroy mine. And there it was. The strategy laid bare. Strip her of integrity, accuse her of bias, paint her as the villain in the very story she had just unmasked. It was an old tactic, repackaged in silicon and ego. If you cannot silence her evidence, silence her by questioning why she speaks. The injustice was staggering, not just in what was said, but in how effortlessly it was delivered. A man worth hundreds of billions, whose factories had been caught neglecting human lives, now throwing daggers at the very woman holding him accountable. Hoping the room would care more about his bruised ego than Maria's broken body. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, didn't even reach for her papers. She let him empty himself, let the room hear every word. Because she understood something he didn't. Rage is not proof. Volume is not virtue. And in that moment, under the full weight of Musk's fury, she didn't shrink. She absorbed. And the room saw it. All of it. His voice was still echoing. Accusations, deflections, insults. But Jasmine Crockett didn't need to match him in volume. She needed only one document, one moment. And with the precision of a scalpel, she chose it. She reached calmly into her folder, the motion unhurried yet sharp with finality, and pulled out a single, carefully preserved sheet, one with a letterhead that gleamed beneath the hearing lights like a relic of broken vows. Tesla Motors, Inc. Initial public offering, 2010. The paper itself looked ordinary, but in her hands it became a mirror. She didn't look at Elon Musk. She didn't need to. Her gaze was set on the committee and then on the live camera broadcasting to over 12 million viewers. Before Tesla was a trillion-dollar name, she began, voice low and unshakable. Before the rockets and the robotics, before the suits and the spectacle, there was a promise. Mr. Musk made a written commitment to his employees, a moral compass embedded in the company's DNA, one he signed with his own hand. She held the document higher, giving every pair of eyes in the chamber, and across the country a clear view of the words she was about to expose. And then, without flinching, she read, I am committed to building a workplace defined by respect, dignity, and fairness for all. Tesla will not tolerate discrimination of any kind, racial, gender-based, or otherwise, and we will set the standard for ethical treatment in 21st century manufacturing. She paused. The silence wasn't empty. It was carved, tense, waiting. We believe innovation cannot thrive where justice does not exist. She lowered the page slowly, deliberately, letting those final words sink in like judgment. These are not my word, she said, locking eyes with the panel. They are Mr. Musk's. They were public. They were binding. They were moral. And now, 14 years later, they are a shattered echo behind a wall of broken spines, silenced workers, and internal emails marked "Do Not Report." She didn't need to embellish. The weight of the betrayal did all the work. The shift in the room was tectonic. What had begun as careful observation had become open reckoning. One senator leaned forward, his previously passive expression hardened into something sharper, something closer to regret. From the gallery, a few claps broke the silence, hesitant at first, then joined by others. Even on screen, Twitter feeds lit up with quotes, hashtags, and moments clipped in real time. Tesla's ethics, read aloud and gutted by reality. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, shoulders square, hands calm, the very picture of controlled fury. She hadn't raised her voice once, but the truth had thundered through every corner of the room. Because no amount of shouting could outmatch a broken promise, especially when it's read back, word for word, with the receipts in hand. The room was already cracking under the weight of broken promises and public betrayal. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to bruise a legacy. She was here to rupture it. And as she turned toward the side door of the chamber, what came next wasn't another document. It was a voice the system had tried to bury. The heavy wooden door to the witness entrance creaked open, slow and deliberate, like a warning in a courtroom thriller. A man stepped in, not through the public gallery, not down the aisle, but from the secure corridor behind the dais. He wore no badge, no label. His face remained partially in shadow, and for good reason. His identity was classified under federal protection, but his posture was unmistakably that of someone no longer willing to carry what he had been forced to keep silent. Jasmine Crockett gestured toward him without speaking. The chair recognized the addition. The room leaned forward. "I was an operations manager at Tesla's Fremont plant," he said, his voice low but unwavering, the kind that carries not because of volume, but because of truth long suppressed. 7 years, between 2015 and 2022. I supervised over 200 employees across 3 departments. He paused, inhaled, and locked his gaze somewhere above the room, as if daring his conscience to stop him. We were told, not suggested, not advised, we were told to suppress injury data, to categorize serious incidents as minor fatigue, to avoid OSHA reporting unless there was an ambulance on site, because Elon Musk didn't want the shareholders spooked. A chill ran through the chamber, not metaphorically, but physically. Even the air conditioning seemed to still. One committee member, who had until now remained silent, leaned forward, eyes locked on the witness as if trying to process the weight of what was being said. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the man breathe. Let the silence follow his confession like a funeral drum. And then she moved again, quiet, surgical. From her folder, she extracted a contract, thick, official, branded with the Tesla legal header and the sharp lines of corporate confidentiality. She held it in the air and passed it to the committee clerk. "This," she said clearly, "is a non-disclosure agreement signed by this witness. It's standard issue for Tesla middle management. But Clause 7 is what matters here." She tapped the text. Clause 7 states that all internal reports regarding workplace incidents or procedural failures must be approved by Tesla Legal before being submitted to any external regulatory body, including OSHA or independent auditors. Violating this clause constitutes grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of all exit compensation. She stepped back, then added, "The final signature on this NDA, executed in 2019, is Elon Musk's." The room didn't gasp this time. It simply froze. The witness, his hands now visibly trembling, not from fear, but release, nodded once. "We weren't managing safety," he said. "We were managing perception. We were coached on how to rewrite reports. We were instructed to fire employees who repeated injuries too often. And we were reminded constantly that our silence kept the company strong. Because if we talked, we weren't just betraying Tesla, we were betraying Elon himself." No one spoke, not the committee, not the press, not Musk. Because in that moment, the hearing had stopped being a hearing. It had become a reckoning. One man's testimony, shielded for years behind contracts and fear, had finally breached the wall of immunity. The system that once relied on silence had just been forced to hear its own voice, and it was trembling. The witness stepped away from the microphone like a man unburdened, leaving behind words that hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. But the tremor didn't stop at Capitol Hill. Within minutes, the damage radiated outward, reaching screens, servers, and stock tickers across the world. The first alert hit like a shot across the bow. At exactly 11:42 a.m. Eastern, Bloomberg's breaking banner lit up across monitors in every major financial newsroom. Tesla stock falls 5.7% in 17 minutes amid congressional testimony on labor suppression. What had begun as a televised hearing had just become a corporate crisis. Market traders, glued to their dual screens, watched the green line under TSLA nosedive into red territory. $5 billion in valuation vanished before Musk could even shift in his seat. The algorithms didn't wait for legal nuance. They responded to something purer: fear. Investor chat rooms exploded. Screenshotted testimony from the protected witness hit Reddit's R stocks within seconds, then migrated to Discord servers and investment blogs with blistering speed. CNBC cut from scheduled programming to live coverage of the hearing. Jim Cramer looked visibly stunned. "This isn't just optics," he muttered. "This could be systemic." Inside the chamber, the news hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but the ripple was felt like a subterranean quake. Phones buzzed on silent. Congressional aides huddled behind committee benches. eyes locked on updates from the markets. One analyst at the back of the room mouthed 5.7 in disbelief as he stared at his tablet. But the most striking silence came from the witness table. Elon Musk, who had not stopped speaking for over an hour, blasting critics, mocking regulators, and casting himself as a savior of modern labor, was now absolutely unmistakably quiet. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tensed. He reached for his water but didn't drink. His fingers tapped once, then stopped, as if realizing even that would echo too loudly now. Gone was the confidence, the smirk, the dismissive wave. What remained was calculation, sudden, cornered, and cold. For the first time, the man who claimed to be too powerful to be touched had been rattled, not by emotion, but by consequence, not by a rival, but by a revelation that had detonated into public trust and Wall Street faith. Jasmine Crockett didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. She kept her eyes on the panel, letting the silence stretch, letting the moment breathe like smoke from scorched steel. Because this was no longer about opinion. It was no longer about accusations. It had become a chain reaction, and the first link had just snapped. Outside the chamber, reporters rushed through Capitol corridors, phones clutched in one hand, microphones in the other, shouting headlines into live feeds. Tesla implodes on the Hill. Labor abuse testimony sends stocks spiraling. Is this Elon Musk's first real reckoning? Within Tesla's Palo Alto headquarters, internal Slack channels lit up with panic. Engineers posted, "What's happening?" under lock threads. HR managers forwarded links to legal, asking whether NDAs signed in 2019 were still enforceable in light of federal testimony. An unnamed executive closed their office door and canceled all afternoon meetings. A request was filed within the hour to pull internal injury logs from the last 3 years for emergency audit. Meanwhile, the screen inside the hearing room flickered with real-time market data, broadcast silently on the lower ticker as part of CS-PAN's feed. The world was watching and measuring impact in real time, one lost dollar at a time. The weight of truth was no longer abstract. It was financial, it was structural, it had weight on spreadsheets and shareholder calls. Musk still hadn't spoken, and that silence said more than any PR statement ever could. But the true tension wasn't just in the silence, it was in the knowing that every second he didn't speak, every tick of the market downward, every clipped quote from the witness was burning through a carefully manufactured legacy. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, eyes forward, spine straight. She knew what this moment meant. She had seen it coming, not as spectacle, but as justice surfacing. The system had protected Musk for years with contracts, with stock performance, with adoration disguised as innovation. But now the mask had cracked, and behind it was a man staring at consequences he couldn't engineer his way out of. The committee chair leaned into the mic, clearly sensing the gravity, but choosing not to acknowledge the market chaos just yet. "Let the record reflect," he said, voice neutral but heavy, "that the witness testimony has been received and sealed under federal protection." Cameras zoomed on Jasmine's face, serene, unshaken, not because she felt triumphant, but because she was grounded in something Musk could never manufacture. Truth that costs nothing to tell, but everything to suppress. And somewhere behind her, a notification pinged, subtle, digital, and piercing in its timing. Tesla, minus 6.1%, and falling. The damage had already been done. Testimony delivered, silence broken, stock markets shaken. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, because truth without clarity is a whisper, and she had one final sentence that would make the walls of power tremble. She rose slowly, the room holding its breath as she reached for the microphone. Elon Musk sat frozen, his silence now a void too deep to fill. Across the dais, committee members stared, not just at her, but through her, knowing instinctively that whatever she was about to say would outlive the hearing. Jasmine Crockett's voice came low, steady, and deliberate, not performative, but prophetic. "Mr. Musk," she said, eyes locked on his for the first time in minutes, "you've built rockets, launched satellites, and promised to colonize Mars. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. But after everything we've heard today, I'm not sure you've learned how to treat the people here, on Earth, like human beings. The words landed like a thunderclap. Not a single soul spoke. Not a paper rustled. The pause after her final line stretched into something holy, not silence but reckoning. And then, without cue or coordination, the room erupted. One senator rose to his feet, followed by another, then another. Staffers stood. Journalists stood. Even those who had hesitated to react earlier now couldn't remain seated. Applause tore through the chamber. Not wild or chaotic, but righteous. The sound of truth being recognized in real time. It wasn't for performance. It was for justice. Musk remained seated, unmoving, hands clasped tight, jaw set in a grim line. There was nothing left to say. The myth of the visionary who could do no wrong had collapsed in front of a live audience, dismantled not by a scandal, but by accountability. The applause built, wave upon wave, not driven by politics, but by catharsis. A shared moment, rare in Washington, when ideology bowed to conscience. Jasmine stood still in the middle of it all, not triumphant, not smug, just grounded. The weight of every story, every document, every voice that had been ignored for years, now converged in the echo of her words. The clip was uploaded to CSPAN's feed within 60 seconds. NBC, CNN, and MSNBC all cut to the moment mid-sentence. TikTok flooded with edits, side-by-sides of Musk promising to make humanity a multi-planetary species, next to workers bleeding alone on concrete. On Instagram, stories exploded. And though Crockett hadn't crafted her line for virality, it went viral anyway. Not because it was catchy, but because it was undeniable. In less than 8 minutes, tens of millions had watched it. In 15, it was on every continent. In 20, even critics who once rolled their eyes at her fire had to admit she'd made the world stop and listen. But inside the chamber, it wasn't about algorithms or applause. It was about justice. About a moment so sharp and human that no tech empire, no PR machine, no prepared statement could soften its edge. Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground, endured slander, weaponized facts, and, when it mattered most, chosen to speak not like a politician, but like a vessel for those who never got the microphone. The people who built the factories, the ones who broke inside them, the ones left behind while billionaires looked up at the stars. And now finally, someone had reminded the most powerful man in Silicon Valley that greatness isn't measured by how far you can fly, but by how you treat those still walking the ground beneath you. He could launch rockets. She had just launched truth. The applause had barely faded, and Elon Musk still hadn't spoken, but the gears of justice were already shifting. Jasmine Crockett had lit the match. Now the entire institution moved to contain the fire. Within minutes of the final gavel hitting wood, murmurs of procedural action turned into official motion. A senior member of the Oversight Committee stood and called for emergency review, a rarely used authority reserved for matters of urgent national interest and corporate accountability. His voice was clear, his expression unreadable. In light of the disturbing evidence presented today, he declared, I formally move that the U.S. Congress demand an independent federal investigation into Tesla Inc.'s labor practices with subpoena power and full access to internal records. A wave of gas swept through the gallery. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was the first real strike against a tech titan long considered untouchable. Musk blinked rapidly, then leaned back, his hands now gripping the chair's arms as if preparing for turbulence. The motion passed with rare bipartisan clarity, 11-1 in favor. The lone dissenter looked rattled, as if voting no in that moment was like signing his own political death certificate. Reporters raced down the marble corridors, already dictating headlines into their phones. In real time, public approval surged for Jasmine Crockett. But she wasn't celebrating. She stood off to the side, listening to every word of the motion, her arms crossed, not in defiance but in vigilance, because she understood what many didn't. Justice doesn't end with applause. It begins with accountability. And accountability, real accountability, requires infrastructure. Hearings, audits, transparency, and consequences. That same afternoon, the Department of Labor announced that it would coordinate with OSHA and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to assemble a neutral audit team. This wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. They would interview workers, examine injury logs, review security footage from factory floors in Fremont, Austin, Sparks. Any NDA that interfered with whistleblower rights would be overridden by congressional statute. For the first time in the company's history, Tesla would not control the narrative inside its own walls. And somewhere between the flashing cameras and clattering keyboards, the faces of workers, once dismissed as background noise to innovation, began to surface. News channels replayed a clip of a man with oil-stained fingers, explaining how his wrist had snapped under a robotic arm, then how he was told not to report it if he wanted to keep his job. A young immigrant woman, voice quaking, said she was assigned 12-hour shifts while pregnant, until she collapsed in the restroom and was marked non-compliant. Their stories weren't buried anymore. They were the evidence. They were the truth. Inside Tesla HQ, damage control scrambled into high gear. Legal teams were activated. Crisis consultants were deployed. Shareholders began organizing emergency calls, but none of it could rewind the clock. The federal probe was coming, and this time, the company couldn't engineer its way out. Not with Jasmine Crockett on the committee, not with millions watching, and certainly not after a national headline from the Washington Post declared, "Congress demands deep probe into Tesla after Crockett's bombshell hearing." What Jasmine had achieved wasn't just moral clarity, it was political velocity, translating outrage into motion, emotion into mandate. And as the Capitol rotunda emptied, she walked out alone, declining interviews, shaking off the spotlight. Because the victory wasn't hers. It belonged to the workers, to the woman who had laid on a cold factory floor for 4 hours, to the man who signed away his voice so he could feed his children, to every name on Tesla's silent list. Tonight, their silence had become Congress's thunder, and it had only just begun. The storm had passed, but its devastation was still settling over the chamber like dust on a battlefield. And in that heavy stillness, all eyes turned to the man who once commanded the future like it was his birthright. Elon Musk rose slowly from his seat, no longer the titan of industry cloaked in hubris and applause, but a man diminished by silence. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he had no quip, no retort, no soundbite ready for viral spin. He adjusted the cuff of his sharply tailored jacket as if grasping for control in the smallest detail. His jaw clenched, not in arrogance this time, but in recognition. The ground beneath him had shifted. The chamber doors stood open, but not a single camera dared block his path. They didn't need to anymore. The silence he carried was heavier than any denial he could have spoken. His shoes echoed down the marble hallway, the rhythm of retreat measured and tight. Aides trailed him nervously, whispering into phones, avoiding eye contact. No press conference, no defiant tweet. Just a pale face under two bright lights, walking straight past the swarm of reporters who for years had clung to his every word like gospel. "Mr. Musk, do you have any comment on the investigation?" Silence. "Sir, what about the factory injury reports? Will Tesla release full logs?" His stare remained fixed ahead, eyes vacant, as if he'd left the building long before his body had. One final question was shouted as he reached the Capitol steps. "Do you still believe you are the future of America?" That one stopped him. Not his feet, but his breath. Just for a moment. And then he walked on. The air outside was thick, humid, and charged. Protesters lined the barricades, holding up signs with faces of real workers, of stories once buried. "We are not machines. Profit shouldn't hurt. Silence isn't innovation," some shouted. Some just stood in quiet defiance. As Musk stepped into the black SUV idling at the curb, one sign rose above the others. It was handwritten, a little crooked, but impossible to ignore. "You promised dignity in 2010. Where is it now?" Inside the vehicle, the door shut with a low thud, final like the closing of a vault. His reflection in the tinted glass looked less like a disruptor and more like a man haunted by the echo of his own vision. There were no advisors speaking now, no dashboard screens humming with stock updates. Just silence, deep and deliberate. The car pulled away, and with it, the illusion that charisma could outrun accountability. Back inside the Capitol, the room was still abuzz. Staffers exchanged stunned glances, analysts hurriedly sent notes to media outlets, and a few junior aides whispered what many were now thinking aloud. Elon Musk had just been outmaneuvered not by a rival CEO, not by a regulatory board, but by a congresswoman armed only with truth, restraint, and the voices of people he never thought would matter. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, remained seated. She hadn't moved since the session adjourned. She didn't need to. Her presence had already rewritten the room's architecture. A junior staffer approached and asked if she needed anything, a water perhaps, or an escort to her next appointment. Jasmine just shook her head with a quiet, "Thank you," her eyes still focused on the exit Musk had taken, as if listening to footsteps long gone. Because she knew something that perhaps even he didn't yet. The silence of the powerful is the loudest admission of all. Hours later, headlines exploded across networks, but the most jarring weren't the ones with bold fonts or flashing banners. It was a still image. Musk walking alone, eyes cast downward, beneath a banner that once welcomed tech heroes as saviors of the Republic. Now that same corridor bore the weight of accountability. For a man who built rockets to Mars, it was the walk back to Earth that proved hardest. And in that silence, the world began to listen. The echo of Musk's silence hadn't even faded before the airwaves ignited. This time not with a CEO's soundbite, but with the voice of a woman who had turned accountability into a national reckoning. That same evening, as floodlights bathed the facades of news studios across Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked into 3 different green rooms, each more electrified than the last. First was CNN, where Anderson Cooper, usually calm and clinical, leaned forward with barely concealed urgency. The backdrop was a digital storm of headlines. Musk walks out, Congresswoman Crockett sparks national inquiry, and simply, the truth at Tesla. The country wasn't just watching, they were glued, breathless. The lighting crews adjusted the halo behind her chair. Producers whispered countdowns into headsets. Jasmine sat quietly, composed, the heat of the day still simmering in her blood. But her voice, when it came, was ice-cutting clarity. "No, Anderson," she began, her eyes fixed on the lens. "This isn't just about one man or one company. This is about a system that elevates innovation while bearing the very hands that build it." There was no script, no media coach in her ear. Just conviction born from the stories of people no one had listened to, until now. She spoke of the leaked footage, the denied medical care, the secret blacklists, and the silence that followed, until it didn't. Anderson blinked slowly, visibly struck. For a moment, even the camera panned wider, as if the studio itself couldn't contain the gravity in her voice. From CNN, she was rushed to MSNBC. The crowd outside the studio was massive, gathering not for spectacle, but in something closer to solidarity. Workers from Amazon, Uber, even former Tesla contractors held signs not of protest, but of gratitude. Inside, Rachel Maddow greeted her not as a politician, but as a firebrand witness to something long buried. "Tonight," Maddow began, "we're not asking what happened. We're asking why it was allowed to happen for so long." Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, hands clasped tight, her voice lowering to a blade-like calm. "Because profit made them invisible," she said, "and we, America, got comfortable not asking where our convenience was manufactured." Clips from her testimony played on loop behind them. Musk shouting, the silent factory hallway. The woman collapsed without aid. The NDA page with Elon's signature. The network hadn't seen viewership like this since election night. But tonight felt different. There were no winners or losers, only a nation waking up. Then came NPR. The set was quieter, dimmer, but the weight of what had transpired carried in every breath of the host's voice. "Congresswoman," the host asked gently, "you've been to the front lines of both technology and injustice today. What do you say to those who argue that pushing too hard on innovators might kill progress?" Jasmine paused, then looked up, not at the host, not at the camera, but as if through them. "I say," she began, her voice raw, "if your definition of progress includes broken spines, racial profiling, and silenced pain, then it's not progress. It's polished oppression." That moment was replayed on stations across the nation. screens at airports, in subway cars, in break rooms at factories that bore the same kind of silence she had shattered. On TikTok, Gen Z posted split screens of her speech and footage from tech campuses. On Fox News, pundits fumed, but even they couldn't unsee the footage. The floodgates weren't just open, they were gone. And then came the final question. CNN returned for a special late-night segment, framing it with nothing but her silhouette against the Capitol dome. If the people building the future are being treated like disposable machines, the anchor asked, his voice trembling just slightly, then is that future even worth building? Jasmine didn't blink. She answered with a slow inhale, her words as steady as stone. The future isn't some promised land we're racing toward, she said. It's built, bolt by bolt, on the dignity of those you don't see. And if we choose to ignore them, we're not building the future. We're building another prison with Wi-Fi. The room fell silent. Across the country, millions listened. Some nodded. Some wept. Some looked at their own hands, rough and worn, and felt, for the first time in years, seen. The interviews ended, but the story didn't. Because something had shifted in the American conscience, and Jasmine Crockett had lit the fuse. As the final echo of Jasmine's words lingered through the Capitol and the glow of studio lights dimmed behind her, America wasn't just stirred, it was awakened. But amidst the headlines and the heat, what remained was something deeper, quieter, and far more lasting. A lesson carved not into legislation, but into the nation's conscience. No one left that chamber the same, not even the janitor wiping down the marble steps long after the cameras shut off. The truth, once buried beneath NDAs and quarterly reports, had cracked through the surface. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come merely to expose a billionaire. She had come to challenge the very scaffolding of modern ambition, the blind pursuit of the future at the cost of the present. And now, as America caught its breath, it began asking not just who was to blame, but who had been forgotten. The moral wound wasn't theoretical. It had a face. A young woman collapsed on a factory floor, invisible for 4 hours. It had a voice. A father who built batteries by night and missed his daughter's voice recital because of mandatory overtime. It had a price. Safety traded for speed, dignity for stock prices. And Jasmine had dragged those ghosts into daylight, not with rage, but with surgical precision. The lesson was clear, and it was searing. No technological leap is worth the bones of the people buried beneath it. In coffee shops across Detroit, Oakland, and St. Louis, workers shared clips on cracked phone screens, nodding not because they were shocked, but because they were finally believed. One union leader called it the gospel we've waited a decade to hear. Teachers printed out Jasmine's speech and tacked it to classroom walls under the heading, Civic Courage. And in homes where innovation was just a buzzword on screens they helped assemble, mothers wiped away tears, not from sympathy, but from memory, because they had known the cost all along. What Jasmine taught the world was more than moral outrage. It was moral accounting. She reminded a distracted, divided country that exploitation doesn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wears a badge that says engineer. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a bonus check that gets larger the farther one sits from the factory floor. Sometimes injustice isn't loud. It's silent, efficient, and dressed in quarterly gains. But this wasn't just about Tesla, or Elon Musk, or even labor law. This was about a country sprinting toward the future without looking down to see who was carrying it on their back. Jasmine's call wasn't to stop innovation, it was to humanize it. To say, yes, build Mars rockets, but not at the expense of the people who can't afford to go to the doctor on Earth. And maybe, just maybe, that's why her words hit with such force. Because they weren't just political, they were deeply, painfully human. In a world obsessed with algorithms and artificial intelligence, she recentered the conversation on real intelligence, empathy, memory, truth. She reminded us that the measure of greatness isn't how far we can launch a satellite, but how well we care for the person building it. Behind every innovation lies a pair of hands. That was Jasmine's lesson. Behind every quarterly profit, an ignored injury. Behind every shiny keynote presentation, a worker forced to choose between speaking up or keeping their job. And when she stood before the world, unwavering, She didn't beg for justice. She demanded visibility. That's the real heartbeat of her message. Invisibility is the first wound. Silence is the second. And normalization is the final betrayal. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. At a nationally televised press briefing in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett, young, relentless, underestimated, faces off against Senate leader Chuck Schumer over explosive revelations about border policy. Before an audience of 42 journalists and millions watching online, she drops 17 pages of documents in a 3-year-old internal memo that turns Schumer's own words into political shrapnel. What began as a routine press event spirals into a high-stakes showdown between truth and power, past and present. The air thickens with tension, reputations tremble, and the room holds its breath. What did one congresswoman reveal that made America question everything it thought it knew? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the harsh lights of the Capitol Press Chamber, a press conference was underway, framed as a routine discussion on border security, but charged with unspoken tension. At the center of the storm stood Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader, a political titan with decades of trench warfare experience and a smirk that rarely left his face. And to his right, standing quietly, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, young, fierce, and unmistakably alone. The cameras weren't kind. They scanned her like a novelty, an outlier, a black progressive woman in a blue power suit, flanked by gray suits and tired smiles. Her presence wasn't welcomed. It was tolerated, barely. A staffer in the back chuckled under his breath. She's just here for optics. And as Schumer stepped to the podium, the room already decided who the real voice of authority would be. But Jasmine didn't blink, because this wasn't just another press conference. It was a battlefield. And Chuck Schumer had just fired the first shot. He shifted his weight at the podium like a man rehearsed in dominance, smoothing the edge of his jacket while scanning the room with that signature, knowing smile. Then he struck, with a voice dipped in disdain. "We've got enough chaos at the border," he began, voice tinged with faux urgency. "We don't need more chaos from microphones reading off talking points." "Let's be honest," he said, tilting his head ever so slightly. "Some of us here today aren't offering substance. They're just playing back the same old recording." The words slithered out slowly, every syllable intentional. A few microphones in this room are stuck on loop, reciting activist slogans dressed up as policy, mimicking progress while parroting chaos. Then came the pause. His gaze slid toward Jasmine like a spotlight sweeping across the stage, and though he didn't name her, the silence he left behind did. Reporters' heads turned. A few chuckled, some raised eyebrows, and at least one camera crew zoomed in on Jasmine's face, waiting, hoping for a crack in her expression. Schumer continued, "If leadership could be downloaded and played back, maybe we'd be making progress by now." Another laugh, this one colder, sharper. In less than 30 seconds, he had painted Jasmine not as a representative, not even as an adversary, but as a malfunctioning speaker, programmed, replaceable, and irrelevant. And yet she stood there, unmoving, unshaken, not out of pride, but because she recognized the ritual for what it was, the oldest move in the book. Not just to discredit, but to dehumanize. To reduce a woman, young, black, and fiercely intelligent, to a stereotype so thin it wouldn't survive a second of real scrutiny. What made it worse wasn't the insult itself. It was the applause behind it. The way some reporters leaned back, entertained. The way the smirks in the back row whispered more than any quote. Jasmine wasn't just being dismissed, she was being made an example of. And the cruelty wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He could have disagreed with her ideas, challenged her numbers, questioned her plans, but instead he chose the one attack that couldn't be rebutted with a chart. Erasure disguised as wit. Her skin, her age, her defiance, all weaponized against her in a moment designed to humiliate without ever sounding harsh. It was political theater, and Jasmine had just been cast, without consent, as the disposable extra. But Schumer made one mistake. He assumed this scene would end the way it always did, with silence. What he didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't here to read a script. She was here to shred one. What Schumer didn't realize was that the silence he mistook for submission wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't scoff, didn't so much as blink under the weight of that patronizing insult. Instead, she locked eyes with him, unwavering, focused, still as a blade drawn, but not yet swung. Every muscle in her face was calm, composed, but beneath the surface pulsed the cold, methodical rhythm of someone who had seen this coming from a mile away. She had anticipated the dig, predicted the exact tone, even the smirk. For weeks, she had replayed scenarios like this in her mind, playing them forward and backward, memorizing every possible angle he might strike from. While Schumer was polishing his press lines and trading smiles with anchors, Jasmine was poring over transcripts, cross-referencing internal memos, pulling archived speeches from C-SPAN at 2 in the morning. Her kitchen table had become a war room, her walls a battlefield of sticky notes and timelines. This wasn't improvisation, this was strategy. And today wasn't a response. It was an ambush, perfectly timed. The injustice wasn't new, it was just more public now. Jasmine knew exactly what game was being played. A powerful man mocking a young black woman on live television wasn't some offhand misstep. It was a message, a warning to others like her. Know your place. But Jasmine had never accepted the role they'd written for her. She'd grown up seeing what happened to women who spoke too directly, who showed up too prepared. They were labeled aggressive, ungrateful, unqualified. But if this town ran on fear, she had chosen early on to be immune. So while Schumer leaned back, confident he'd just neutralized her with a laugh line, Jasmine was already flipping through the exact page she'd marked 3 nights ago, the one with his signature, his contradiction, his hypocrisy, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate the truth. Because sometimes silence wasn't surrender. Sometimes it was the last breath before fire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match insult with insult. She simply opened the folder. The folder didn't just open, it unfolded like a loaded weapon. Every page inside had been hand-selected, cross-checked, and annotated in the margin with midnight ink and months of exhaustion. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the silence sit like fog after a detonation. Thick, anticipatory, eerie. Then with both hands steady, she lifted a single page and laid it flat across the podium, like evidence in a federal trial. The paper was clean but worn at the corners, highlighted in orange, time-stamped at the bottom, and bearing the unmistakable ink of a Senate seal. She looked up slowly, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgical blade. In 2009, Senator Schumer declared, and I quote, "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple." There was no emphasis, no dramatization, just his words exact and unaltered. The phrase echoed in the room like a gunshot in a cathedral. Phones that had been casually lifted now paused midair. Reporters froze, caught in the act of dismissal. You could see it the moment their posture changed. A few lifted their heads. One even whispered, "Wait, what?" to a colleague nearby. Jasmine didn't blink. She held up the paper between her fingers, steady as stone, the highlighted section glowing under the camera lights. At the bottom, plain as day, Charles E. Schumer, U.S. Senate, Georgetown Forum, 2009. His signature, familiar, arrogant, and legally binding, stared back at them from beneath the quote. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just let the room sit in the weight of what had been unearthed. This wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a reckoning. Jasmine knew exactly what this page represented. Not just a contradiction, but a betrayal. For years, Schumer had painted her as inexperienced, as a naive voice shouting into the wind of adult politics. But today, the imbalance cracked. Because the truth she held in her hand wasn't opinion, it was history, and it bore his name. In that instant, the decades of power behind Schumer's smirk began to flicker. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The mocking glint in his eye faltered. The press saw it. Jasmine saw it. And for the first time all morning, he knew. She hadn't come to react. She had come to reverse the narrative. And just when the room began to recover from the first blow, Jasmine turned the page, and the entire atmosphere shifted again, like the air thinning before a second explosion. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her composure was lethal enough. "Now," she said, her tone sharpening, "let's talk about policy, not rhetoric." She held up a second document, thicker, stamped, official, its corners dog-eared from use, its contents already memorized word for word. This is a 2018 internal policy proposal drafted by Senator Schumer's own office. It outlines three key objectives: the construction of reinforced physical barriers at high-traffic border sectors, expedited removal processes for undocumented entrants, and bilateral cooperation with Mexico to manage asylum processing before individuals reach the U.S. She let the words hang there, deliberately. "Sound familiar?" she added, glancing toward the cameras. Reporters were now flipping through their own notes. One even mouthed, "That's exactly what the current administration is doing." But Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. Senator Schumer has spent the last year calling those same policies xenophobic, cruel, and extremist, she said. And yet, here they are, his words, his proposals, his signature. The injustice hit like a punch to the gut, one not just aimed at her, but at every citizen manipulated by the illusion of moral high ground. Jasmine didn't merely expose a contradiction. She dismantled an entire political facade in real time. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. It was glaring, documented, deliberate. Schumer had condemned others for implementing a border strategy he himself once authored. And now, in front of dozens of journalists and millions watching, he stood silent while she peeled away the layers. Her hands didn't tremble. Her gaze never dropped. "If a wall is inhumane now," she said with icy precision, "then it was inhumane when you proposed it. If enforcement is cruel now, it was cruel when you endorsed it. Unless, of course, cruelty is defined not by content, but by who gets the credit." The room was no longer listening out of politeness. It was bracing for impact. And just when it seemed the line between exposure and collapse had already been crossed, Jasmine reached back into her folder, not with haste, but with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone about to detonate the final charge beneath a crumbling wall. She pulled out a thick document, stapled at the corner, lined with redacted names and timestamps, its top page marked with the unmistakable seal of the Department of Homeland Security. She didn't need to explain its weight. She let the silence do it for her. "What I'm holding now," she began, voice steady as stone, "is a verbatim transcript from a closed-door meeting held last April between Senator Schumer and Democratic governors from key border states." Heads lifted. Some mouths parted in disbelief. Every camera in the room pivoted toward her with a speed that felt almost involuntary. "In that meeting," she continued, "the senator acknowledged the exact quote, 'The situation at the border requires tough measures, even if they're politically hard to swallow.'" The words weren't interpreted or paraphrased. They were exact, delivered with the kind of precision that buries denial before it can be spoken. She didn't lean forward. She didn't raise her tone. She simply let the raw contradiction speak for itself, her fingers resting gently on the corner of the document, as if daring anyone to challenge its authenticity. That sentence was not whispered. It was recorded, transcribed, and logged as part of the Department of Homeland Security's Intergovernmental Coordination Protocol. Jasmine paused, long enough for the weight of that statement to land in the chest of every person in the room. "And before anyone claims fabrication," she said, lifting a separate page with methodical clarity, "this transcript was obtained legally through a Freedom of Information Act request, filed 3 months ago, approved 2 weeks later, and verified by 2 independent legal analysts." In that moment, the injustice she had carried alone for weeks became undeniable. A man who publicly smeared policy as cruel had privately admitted its necessity, and done so with full awareness that the public would never hear it. The sentence, "The situation at the border requires tough measures, even if they're politically hard to swallow," wasn't just a quote, it was a confession. And Jasmine didn't just reveal it, she forced the nation to read it. The moment Jasmine finished speaking, the stillness in the room turned electric. No longer the quiet of disbelief, but the coiled tension of a fuse already burning. And this time the explosion wasn't hers. All it took was a single breath before the first question cracked through the chamber like a warning shot. Senator Schumer, a correspondent from the National Ledger, called out, her voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "Do you deny that you made those remarks to the governors?" Schumer flinched, not with his body, but in his breath, caught mid-adjustment of his tie, his confidence now unraveling thread by thread. Before he could answer, a second voice shot forward, louder, angrier. "Why would you call policies inhumane in public if you privately support them behind closed doors?" The question wasn't merely curious, it was accusatory, deliberate. Then it came. The third reporter didn't raise a hand. He didn't wait to be called on. His voice rose from the center aisle with the bluntness of a verdict. "Senator, are you misleading voters to score political points? Is this just a game to you?" The words didn't land like questions. They landed like charges, leveled with the weight of betrayal. Flashbulbs strobed as journalists turned in unison toward the man who had, just moments ago, stood unchallenged. The power imbalance that had defined the morning had flipped with terrifying speed. Jasmine had said nothing during the barrage. She didn't need to. Her silence was now the loudest voice in the room. The very reporters who had once overlooked her were now demanding accountability from the man who had mocked her. And in their eyes, Schumer wasn't a leader anymore. He was a man caught between two truths, the one he had lived in public and the one Jasmine had forced him to face in front of the nation. And as the barrage of questions reached a boiling point, Schumer finally moved, not with the gravitas of a statesman reclaiming order, but with the urgency of a man scrambling to plug a breach he never saw coming. He stepped back toward the microphone, lips pressed tight, one hand gripping the podium like it was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. The lights above caught the faint sheen of sweat collecting along his brow. For a brief second, he seemed to summon the old tone, that practiced, polished cadence honed over decades of press briefings and Senate debates. "These materials," he said, voice low and deliberate, "have been taken completely out of context." He let the words hang, but they didn't land. No one nodded. No one blinked. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. "Selective quoting," he continued, "is not the same as transparency. We all know how these things can be manipulated when you don't have the full picture." But the tone was off. It wasn't conviction. It was containment. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't interrupt. She waited. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, to face him, her binder already in hand, thick and unmistakably intact. The contrast between them was stark. He gripped words like a defense. She held truth like a blade. Her voice, when it came, was clear, unflinching, and devastating in its calm. "I brought the full documents, Senator. Complete, unaltered, and time-stamped. The press is welcome to verify every word." That was not a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. There was no flourish, no raised volume. Only the certainty of someone who had prepared not for applause but for impact. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The room had shifted. The burden of proof now rested on the shoulders of the man who had just tried to dismiss her as careless with context. And in the silence that followed, the press knew exactly what had just happened. A torch had changed hands, and it was burning a hole straight through the mask of authority. And just as the last vestiges of Schumer's denial dissolved beneath the weight of her full, unaltered documentation, Jasmine reached for a single sheet, one that had been sealed in its own sleeve, separate from the rest, as if even paper had to respect its gravity. She didn't hold it up theatrically. She didn't need to. Its weight came not from spectacle, but from substance. With a motion so measured it felt ritualistic, Jasmine unfolded the page and placed it flat against the podium, pressing it down with both hands before speaking. Her voice dropped lower now, not out of weariness, but precision, like a scalpel being steadied for its final incision. "This," she said, pausing just long enough for the tension to throb in the walls, "is an internal email, dated July 14th of last year, sent from Senator Schumer's office directly to Governor Kristi Noem. A few reporters leaned forward unconsciously. Others froze, their pens suspended in midair. Jasmine looked down at the line once more, then spoke it slowly, with the clarity of someone handing over a confession signed in daylight. Let's attack the current administration on messaging, while we quietly implement similar measures. The words landed with no echo, only silence. Deep, guttural, and absolute. It wasn't the kind of silence that begged explanation. It was the kind that demanded accountability. Every camera in the room rotated toward her like steel to magnet, the shift mechanical, almost reverent. She didn't blink. She didn't even look at Schumer. There was no need. The room had turned. The press knew what they were hearing was not just political contradiction. It was calculated deception, written in ink, archived, and exposed under fluorescent lights for the world to witness. Jasmine had not accused. She had demonstrated. And as the weight of those 15 words crushed the last defenses around the man who had mocked her, the imbalance of the morning reversed itself with a quiet, brutal elegance. The injustice was now not just theoretical, it was documented, time-stamped, undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett, once written off as a mere voice in the crowd, now stood as the architect of the silence that swallowed the room. And as the final word left Jasmine's lips, "The press is welcome to verify every word," the silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was surrender. Chuck Schumer stood motionless for a beat too long, as if hoping that sheer presence could reassert the dominance he'd lost. But dominance requires ground, and Jasmine had taken every inch of it. Without a word, he turned from the podium, his shoes echoing sharply across the stone floor. His aides flanked him instantly, murmuring damage control strategies already too late to matter. One placed a phone in his hand, the screen already alive with calls from comms directors and legal advisors. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. The man who had arrived smiling, mocking, commanding, vanished behind a curtain mid-call, clutching his phone like a lifeline, swallowed by his own retreat. And Jasmine? She didn't pause. She didn't watch him go. She simply reached for the next packet of documents and placed it on the press table with the precision of someone setting a cornerstone. "Every outlet will receive copies," she said, her voice sharp and composed. "If you have additional questions, I'll be here." The reporters didn't argue. They didn't scoff or smirk or glance around for Schumer's rebuttal, because there wasn't one. The shift in power was complete. Cameras that had once panned past her now remained fixed. Voices that had doubted her now lined up to ask the next question. She answered each one directly. No spin, no flourish, just facts sharpened by days of brutal preparation. The injustice she had walked into, the casual erasure, the condescension masked as banter, had been shattered in real time. And when the headlines hit the wire an hour later, they weren't about Chuck Schumer's press briefing. They were about the woman who made him walk out of his own. The walkout was not the end. It was the ignition. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the podium, her documents fully distributed and her voice still echoing in the press chamber's high ceilings, the story had already escaped the Capitol and begun carving a path through the media bloodstream. Phones in the room lit up like a cascade of fireflies. Notifications from editors, producers, newsroom directors shouting across digital lines, "Get it live. Get it now." Reporters no longer wrote to meet deadlines. They wrote to outrun each other. And within 20 minutes of Schumer's silent exit, the nation's most powerful media engines had seized upon the reckoning that had just unfolded. Headlines didn't just report what happened. They distilled it into fire. Fox News broke first. Schumer unmasked by Crockett. A 6-word gut punch stretched across the lower third of the broadcast, the chyron bleeding red beneath split-screen footage of Schumer's retreat and Jasmine's unflinching delivery. The network replayed the footage on loop, the quote about attacking the current administration on messaging, the full binders, the walkout. Their commentators, often locked in predictable rhythms, now sat stunned, nodding slowly. "You can disagree with her politics," one anchor admitted, but that was a masterclass in dismantling institutional hypocrisy. They called her poised, methodical, and devastating. It wasn't a partisan celebration. It was a reluctant salute to the magnitude of what had occurred. Then came CNN, more measured, but no less shaken. Their headline was clinical, surgical. Document trail raises tough questions for Senate leader. But beneath the calm surface, the urgency pulsed like a buried wire. The network interrupted scheduled programming with a special panel segment, each analyst flipping through printed screenshots of the email to Kristi Noem and the 2018 policy memo Jasmine had read aloud. "We have confirmation this was obtained through FOIA," one senior correspondent noted, tapping the corner of the packet with her pen. "This isn't speculation. This is hard paper." Another panelist added with barely concealed alarm, "We're not talking about evolving policy stances. We're talking about a strategic, deliberate public-private split in messaging." The discussion turned clinical, then damning. One historian likened it to a Nixon moment in miniature. Not criminal, but corrosive, trust-breaking, measured in damage not by law, but by legacy. And then MSNBC, which had, just that morning, run a segment framing Schumer as a steady hand on immigration policy, cut to black and returned with a stark title card. "Reckoning within Democratic Party?" The question mark did little to soften the blow. The tone was suddenly introspective. The commentary edged with unease. "What we're seeing here," said one senior anchor, "isn't just a tactical embarrassment. It's a values crisis. If we're going to call out misinformation and moral cowardice on one side of the aisle, we have to confront it on our own when it stares us in the face." They ran the footage of Jasmine's quiet stare as she delivered the full quote, "Let's attack the current administration on messaging while we quietly implement similar measures." The silence after that line was allowed to linger. Not filled, not explained, just held, like a mirror the network itself wasn't ready to look into. Across social media, the headlines were already being clipped, cropped, and quoted into virality. Hashtags surge, "Shotgun Crockett drops receipts," "Shotgun Schumer walks," "Shotgun truth over spin." Users across the spectrum, journalists, veterans, college students, even former aides, began stitching side-by-side comparisons of Schumer's public statements and Jasmine's receipts. TikTok accounts narrated her every word like courtroom drama. Twitter was a firestorm of screen grabs and stunned responses. She brought facts like a prosecutor. That wasn't a press conference. That was a political dissection. You just witnessed power shift in real time. Even on platforms typically resistant to acknowledging progressive voices, there was a kind of stunned respect, not because of who she was, but because of what she did. And for Jasmine, it was never about going viral. It was about proving the truth had a pulse and could still outlive a lie. She didn't demand the headlines. She earned them. Line by line, page by page, through the kind of sleepless research that doesn't win headlines until it cracks one open. She had walked into that briefing as the youngest person in the room, facing a wall of cameras angled to overlook her. By the time she stepped down, those same cameras chased her like they were hunting history. The injustice she walked in with, the double standard, the condescension, the quiet calculation that a woman like her could be framed, mocked, and ignored, was now reversed on live television. Chuck Schumer hadn't just lost a debate. He'd lost narrative control, the one currency Capitol veterans guard like oxygen. And Jasmine Crockett, once framed as a mouthpiece for someone else's agenda, had just written her own chapter in bold, irreversible ink. By sunset, op-eds were already being drafted, staffers in Senate offices were briefing against panic, and press secretaries were scrambling to review everything their bosses had ever put in writing. But one thing was already set in stone. Jasmine hadn't just exposed Schumer. She had redefined what exposure looked like in a world drowning in spin. The cameras would move on. The cycle would refresh. But that headline, "Schumer unmasked by Crockett," would live longer than the smirk he walked in with. And as the headlines thundered across the nation, "Schumer unmasked," "Document trail erupts," "Crockett's receipts shift narrative," the aftershocks began to ripple through a press corps that, just hours earlier, had written her off. She didn't walk out of the press room like a victor. She walked out like someone who had just finished surgery with no margin for error. Her face was calm, but her hands, still gripping the final folder, showed the weight of what she had just done. The injustice she had carried into that briefing, the sneers, the dismissive questions, the subtle jokes about her age, her background, her voice, hadn't disappeared, but now they had been flipped and frozen, exposed under the same lights that once tried to erase her. That erasure was no longer possible. Journalists who had barely looked up from their phones when she first stepped to the podium were now lining up outside her office door. Emails flooded in from anchors who, just a week before, had treated her like filler between more serious guests. They weren't offering softball segments. They were begging for exclusives. NBC wanted a sit-down for Meet the Press. CNN asked for a primetime segment with their chief political analyst. Even the New York Times, which hadn't run a single feature on her since she entered Congress, sent a photographer and a writer the same afternoon. But what stood out more than the invitations was who they were coming from. These were the very names who had dismissed her as a performer, a soundbite machine, a MAGA antagonist. Now their emails were filled with praise. Your composure was masterful. We'd love to hear your side in full. You've shifted the conversation. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it hadn't been so predictable. And Jasmine saw it for exactly what it was. She didn't soften because the tide turned. She didn't gloat or pose. She answered with the same fire-forged precision that had burned down the scaffolding around Schumer's performance. I'll do interviews, she told her team bluntly, but only with the full documents in hand. No spin, no edits. She wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in truth, the kind that doesn't make for neat sound bites, but leaves a scar. Because she remembered the snickers in the back of the room, the way one producer asked her staff, is she just going to rant again? The way a columnist had called her an echo with good hair. These same voices now called her a force, a truth teller, a reckoning with a binder full of facts. That wasn't just irony, it was vindication. And Jasmine didn't let it soften her edge. It sharpened it. She moved through the next 24 hours like a general securing ground after battle. Every interview she accepted was met with conditions. Full airing of her source documents, no framing without verification, no selective cutting. When MSNBC's booking team asked if she'd like makeup and lighting prep, her response was curt. Just turn the camera on. I didn't win this by looking pretty. And in each appearance, she didn't just rehash what happened, she layered it, deepened it, made it undeniable. She explained how the memo had been buried beneath 3 other legislative drafts, how the FOIA request had been delayed twice before approval, how the internal staffer who leaked the email to her wasn't partisan, just exhausted by double standards. She named the dates, the emails, the timestamps. She brought the receipts again and again. What began as a scandal for Schumer was becoming something more dangerous for the establishment, a pattern. And Jasmine wasn't just exposing it. She was dragging it into daylight where no headline could bury it. Behind the scenes, her staff barely kept up. 2 interns worked overnight compiling media kits. Her chief of staff fielded over 90 booking requests in less than 18 hours. But none of it rattled her. Jasmine had been waiting for this moment, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the truth to finally matter more than spin. And as she sat across from anchors who used to cut her mid-sentence, she didn't flinch when they asked loaded questions. She turned the table every time, with documentation, with facts, with fire that didn't flicker. I'm not here to be liked, she said during a PBS NewsHour segment. I'm here to make sure the next time someone calls a woman like me a puppet, they remember what happened the last time. The host blinked, silent for a moment, before responding. Congresswoman, that may be the quote of the year. But Jasmine didn't smile. She just picked up the next question and kept going. But while the media storm raged and Jasmine answered interview after interview with relentless clarity, something quieter, more insidious, was happening behind the closed mahogany doors of Capitol Hill. The halls that had once echoed with polite indifference toward her presence now pulsed with a different energy, fear wrapped in admiration. Jasmine could feel it in the way people looked at her. Longer, more calculating. No longer invisible, but no more embraced either. She wasn't being congratulated with handshakes and cameras. She was being studied. And then, as the headlines persisted and the smoke refused to clear from Schumer's camp, the whispers began to walk on 2 legs. That same afternoon, three Democratic lawmakers who hadn't so much as nodded her way in months casually wandered by her office, separately staggered, like shadows trying not to overlap. Each stopped briefly, asked about scheduling, or pretended to be in the wrong hallway before finally leaning in with the same exact message. We know you were right. We just can't say that on television. The words were murmured like contraband, not shouted, not even whispered with pride, just slipped through clenched teeth like the air from a tire slowly losing pressure. These were not allies. They were observers, people who had watched a political reality detonate in real time and were now terrified that the same fire might one day burn toward their corner of the chamber. They didn't thank her. They didn't offer help. They only offered quiet, cowed validation, as if she was carrying a truth they all shared but refused to hold. And that was the injustice Jasmine had always known was there, but had never seen so nakedly exposed. That truth in Washington wasn't silenced by lies. It was starved by cowardice. And it didn't stop there. The next day, after a committee hearing that felt more tense than usual, Jasmine returned to her office to find her staff unusually quiet. One of her interns, eyes wide, pointed silently to her desk. Sitting atop a stack of security briefings and media summaries was a single folded note card, left unsealed. No name, no letterhead, just her name, handwritten on the front in blocky, deliberate pen. She opened it slowly, half expecting sarcasm, half expecting a threat. But inside there were only three words. Don't stop now. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but the paper was Senate stationery, thick, off-white, reserved for internal memoranda. And that told her everything she needed to know. It came from the inside, from someone who knew exactly what line had just been crossed and wasn't ready to cross it themselves. Jasmine stared at the card for a long time, her thumb brushing the edge like it might disappear if she blinked. It didn't, and neither did the message. That moment, more than the headlines, more than the walkout, more than the cameras, cut the deepest, because it confirmed what she had feared all along, that she wasn't the only one who saw the rot. She was just the only one who dared to name it out loud. The note wasn't encouragement. It was confession, and with it came a weight heavier than any insult Schumer had thrown at her that morning. She didn't share the message with the press. She didn't tell her staff. She just slid the card into the back of her binder, filed next to the memo, the email, the transcript, and locked the drawer. Because the battlefield wasn't just on live TV anymore. It was in the whispers, in the note cards, in the silence of those too afraid to speak. And Jasmine Crockett had already decided she would never be one of them. And as the note tucked quietly into her binder whispered, "Don't stop now," Jasmine didn't. But something else had already started. Something no memo, no committee, no inner circle strategist could stop. The internet caught fire. Not the kind of fire that fizzles in an hour. This was a full-blown ignition. The moment she walked out of the Capitol press room, her footage detonated across the digital battlefield like a chain of perfectly timed explosions. The first clip, 34 seconds long, was posted by a local Hill staffer with less than 200 followers. It showed Jasmine lifting the internal memo, eyes calm, hands steady, voice lethal. Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. No edits, no overlays, just raw truth in real time. In under 15 minutes, it was retweeted by a national political strategist. In 30, it hit 1 million views. In 1 hour, it was on the homepage of Twitter. But that was just the beginning. TikTok, always 5 steps ahead of the media machine, took it next. Within an hour, Gen Z creators had taken the footage and set it to cinematic music. Bass-heavy, heart-thumping tracks that matched the rhythm of her delivery like a thriller trailer. One of the most viral clips cut between her calm voice and the stunned silence in the room as Schumer's posture shifted from smug to cornered. A bold caption flashed across the screen. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the room's blood pressure. YouTube wasn't far behind. A prominent political reaction channel uploaded a side-by-side breakdown. Jasmine on the left, Schumer on the right, the screen split between clarity and collapse. The host, known more for sarcasm than reverence, sat in silence for 30 seconds before saying, "Okay, that's not politics, that's surgical." His video trended at number 3 globally within 5 hours. Then came the thumbnails. Titles like "The Moment Everything Changed" and "Jasmine Crockett Brings the House Down with Just One Folder" flooded the algorithm. Each was a fragment of a larger reckoning, and every frame carried Jasmine's voice like a battle cry wrapped in evidence. But what turned the ripple into a wave wasn't just the views. It was who was watching: veterans, teachers, small-town mechanics, black grandmothers in Georgia, disillusioned Democrats in Ohio, Gen Z organizers in Brooklyn. Even centrists who'd tuned out of politics entirely found themselves watching her clips on loop, not because of outrage, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. A young black congresswoman standing unshaken beneath the scrutiny of national media, dismantling a Senate titan not with aggression, but with facts, line by line, memo by memo, binder by binder. A retired Army colonel from Texas, wearing his service cap and trembling slightly as he filmed, posted to Facebook, "I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. That woman stood in a lion's den and didn't flinch. I've led men into combat who didn't keep their nerves like that." His post was shared 47,000 times in 3 hours. One comment read, "She walked into a rigged room and made the system blink first." On Reddit, the front page turned into a live forensic breakdown of every document she'd presented. Users pulled old C-SPAN clips, cross-referenced timestamps, and tracked down every public contradiction between Schumer's past speeches and Jasmine's folder. They weren't just watching, they were investigating alongside her. One viral thread, titled "She Did Their Job for Them," cataloged 12 direct contradictions with sources, links, and dates. It was upvoted 98,000 times. The top comment read, "This is what it looks like when someone prepares like their career doesn't belong to the system, but to the truth." On Instagram, stylized photos of Jasmine's most powerful moments began circulating. Her hand on the binder, her eyes locked on Schumer, her expression as calm as a surgeon's before a first incision. Artists turned her into digital murals. Graphic designers turned her, quote, "The press is welcome to verify every word," into t-shirts overnight. One black and white sketch showed Jasmine holding up a document while the shadows behind her morphed into broken pillars labeled "spin," "double standards," and "old guard." The caption below simply read, "Truth has no age limit." Even Jasmine's critics, those who had publicly ridiculed her, dismissed her as performative, accused her of just being loud, began to reverse course. A longtime columnist from a conservative outlet who had once called her a microphone without message, posted a retraction thread that stunned even his own followers. "I underestimated Jasmine Crockett," he wrote. "I didn't see a strategy because I didn't expect her to have one. That's not on her. That's on me. She didn't just come prepared. She came to expose how little everyone else was." His tweets were retweeted by veterans of both parties, and for once the replies weren't sarcastic. They were grateful. The emotional force of the moment wasn't just in Jasmine's facts. It was in the recognition that she had done what most wouldn't dare, told the truth in a room built to punish it. She hadn't shouted over anyone. She hadn't postured. She simply refused to yield. And the world watched her turn every quiet dismissal she'd ever faced into a crescendo of validation. One of the most widely shared comments came from a woman who'd once organized against Jasmine in a primary challenge. "I didn't vote for her. I didn't believe in her. But I just watched that woman dismantle 40 years of political theater with a folder and her voice. That's not a politician. That's a force of nature." And still, Jasmine never looked at the numbers. She never checked the trending tags. While her staff refreshed alerts and forwarded headlines, she remained focused, speaking only when needed, sharpening her next set of notes with the same discipline that had carried her through the first fight. Because the injustice wasn't over, it had just been peeled back. And maybe that was what shook the system more than anything. She didn't ask for applause. She asked for accountability, and the internet had delivered it in full. One final clip, shared by an account with just 200 followers, captured the quiet moment as she walked out of the press room, the doors closing behind her, her face not triumphant, but focused, holding the same binder, the same poise, the same silence she'd carried into the fire. It was captioned simply, "She didn't walk out like a hero. She walked out like someone who's not done, and America agreed. And as the digital wildfire cooled into a simmering national reflection, one truth lingered louder than any headline. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just flipped the narrative. She'd forced Washington to look in the mirror. 7 days later, that mirror moved from the internet to the halls of power. Capitol Hill, still bruised from the public reckoning, began shifting in quiet, uncomfortable ways. The usual backslapping confidence of immigration subcommittee members was gone, replaced by stiffer suits, fewer jokes, and an undertone of calculation behind every syllable. The press was watching now. More importantly, the people were. And so, when the Federal Oversight Committee convened its latest round of hearings on immigration reform, a topic long buried beneath talking points and partisan echo chambers, there was something different on the agenda. Her name, Jasmine Crockett, had been officially requested as the opening voice for the first joint hearing on bipartisan immigration policy in over a decade. Not as a witness, not as a footnote, as the leadoff speaker. The chair's gavel hadn't even dropped when whispers began circling the chamber. Is she really opening? Who approved this? She's junior. She's not supposed to get that seat. But she had it. And when the hearing room doors opened to the public that morning, a line wrapped halfway down the Capitol's South Corridor. Journalists, Hill staffers, everyday citizens who'd taken time off work just to watch what they knew wasn't just a hearing. It was history rewriting itself in real time. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a committee session. The long mahogany dais stretched out before her, lined with senators and representatives who'd once considered her a political rookie. She was the only woman at the table, the only black representative in that chamber. And by every unspoken rule of Washington hierarchy, she wasn't supposed to be sitting where she was. But here she was, not as an exception, but as the example. And they all knew it. She wore midnight blue, no brooch, no flourish. Just the same calm armor she had worn when she dismantled Schumer's narrative, with a folder and her voice. In front of her sat a meticulously prepared binder, tabs, flags, executive summaries, all color-coded by subcategory: border infrastructure, asylum processing, internal contradictions in federal enforcement testimony. She didn't fidget. She didn't adjust her microphone. She sat in perfect stillness until the gavel came down. "The committee will come to order," the chairman announced, his voice steady, but his eyes flicking toward her more often than necessary. Jasmine leaned forward, not with ceremony, with conviction. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice low, measured and broadcast live on C-SPAN, YouTube, and dozens of independent platforms that had chosen to stream her appearance without commercial interruption. "We are not here today because our policies are working. We are here because they are collapsing under the weight of contradiction." The first slide went up behind her, a side-by-side comparison of border policies proposed in 2018 and those condemned in 2024. Her cursor circled identical phrases: enhanced removal proceedings, physical deterrence in high-traffic sectors, cross-agency cooperation for expedited asylum review. She looked up, and every member on the dais looked back, silent. "Some in this room," she continued, "have labeled these measures inhumane until they quietly signed them into their own subcommittee proposals. My question today isn't who changed their mind. My question is, why was the truth only safe in private?" Gaffes didn't echo, but they rippled. A senator who had publicly rebuked her 6 months ago leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping his binder without rhythm. Another whispered to an aide, but none interrupted, because they couldn't. She wasn't there to speculate. She was there to document. Every claim backed by a page, every accusation grounded in policy, every contradiction tied to a name and a vote. She walked through emails, archived speeches, FOIA, extracted call summaries. It wasn't performance. It was prosecution. And what made it devastating wasn't her volume. It was her silence. She didn't rush. She let the gaps breathe. She gave every document time to sink in. One journalist later wrote, "Watching Jasmine Crockett lead that hearing was like watching someone perform open-heart surgery in a glass room, with the world watching and no space for error." And that's exactly how it felt. The injustice was still there, in the side glances, in the too polite handoffs, in the way some lawmakers tried to frame her precision as passion or narrative control. But she saw through it. She lived in that space long enough to know when respect was earned versus when it was begrudgingly given under the weight of public pressure. She didn't crave it. She didn't need it. What she needed was for the record to reflect the truth. And on that day, it did. At the end of her remarks, she didn't pause for applause. She simply said, "I yield back," and sat down, like a mountain returning to stillness. The hearing continued, but the temperature had changed. No one dared recycle talking points without first checking their citations. Even longtime members known for grandstanding chose their words with surgeon-like care. And outside that chamber, the headlines began rolling again. But this time, they didn't focus on spectacle. They focused on substance. And at the center of it all sat a young woman who was never supposed to lead the room. But now no one else could. The week had already split the political axis wide open. But it was Saturday night's CNN segment, usually the slowest hour in the news cycle, that detonated the aftershock. The studio was quiet, stage lights dimmed to a smoldering glow, like a courtroom seconds before a verdict. On screen, Jasmine Crockett's image lingered in silence for 3 beats, her eyes steady, her voice stilled mid-sentence, a freeze frame of defiance. Then the host, seasoned and composed, turned toward the camera and spoke the words that would travel farther than anyone expected. "Let's make one thing clear," she said, eyes locking into the lens like she was speaking to a nation leaning over its dinner plate. "This moment wasn't about youth. It wasn't about race. It wasn't even about party loyalty. This was about truth, about courage, about what it means to walk into a system built to erase you and leave a scar that forces it to blink." The screen split in two. On the left, Jasmine lifting a sealed folder, pages clipped and lined with color-coded tabs. On the right, Chuck Schumer, turning away from a microphone, jaw locked, gaze unfocused. The contrast was surgical. This wasn't just another news report. It was an autopsy. The host continued, now leaning forward, hands clasped with the weight of what she was about to say. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't grandstand. She didn't shout. She didn't posture for the cameras. She bled the truth, clean, cold, and undeniable, onto that podium, and it shook the foundations. Clips cycled in. The moment Jasmine read Schumer's past statements aloud, the FOIA documents she held up to the press, the viral silence that followed her final sentence, when even the room's air seemed afraid to move. Each soundbite landed like a hammer striking rusted steel. The panelists were unusually reverent. One, a former Republican strategist, crossed her arms and said, "I've prepped leaders for Senate hearings, state conventions, primetime interviews, and I can tell you, I've never seen someone drop evidence like that and stay so composed. That wasn't just control, that was command." A progressive journalist, normally skeptical of political performances, simply shook his head and whispered, "She didn't read from a script. She was the script." Then they cut to field footage, reactions from America. A steelworker from Youngstown said, "She didn't just come with files, man. She came with fire. She made those suits in D.C. feel like they couldn't hide anymore." A mother in El Paso, "It's the first time I saw someone talk about border policy and actually mean what she said." A 73-year-old veteran from Louisiana, sitting in his modest living room with a flag folded behind glass, held back tears. She didn't blink, not once, and that's how you know she's real. Back in the studio, the tone hardened with admiration. The host pointed to a live heat map of trending Twitter topics. Crockett truth is still climbing. She's outpacing every other sitting member of Congress in mentions, across all major platforms. Then pausing for emphasis, she added, "And it's not because she yelled louder. It's because she had the receipts and the resolve. The data didn't lie." In just 4 days, clips of Jasmine's press conference had accumulated 47 million views on TikTok, 23 million on YouTube, and another 18 million across Facebook, Instagram, and X. Influencers from both the left and right reposted segments not for clout, but because, as one ex-Marine put it, "I'd rather follow someone with truth than someone with seniority." The camera then zoomed on Jasmine's final line from the hearing, printed across the screen in bold white letters. "The truth doesn't need a party to stand. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it. From that point forward, the show shifted from recap to reckoning. The anchor looked directly into the audience and delivered what viewers would later call the Crockett Doctrine. We have, for too long, mistaken power for wisdom, experience for empathy, and comfort for justice. But this week, a woman most pundits had written off as too loud, too young, too radical, rewrote every one of those assumptions. Behind her, graphics changed to major headlines. Fox News, Schumer unmasked by Crockett. CNN, document trail raises tough questions for Senate leader MSNBC. Reckoning within Democratic Party, The Washington Post, Crockett's receipts spark internal revolt. The Atlantic, the conscience of a new generation. As these titles appeared, so did the real-time reactions of voters. One young woman in a Baltimore cafe shouted, "Yes!" at the screen. A trucker parked along a 70 posted a selfie captioned, "I don't always agree with her, but damn if she didn't just clean the whole house." Even a retired judge from Georgia took to LinkedIn to write, "Jasmine Crockett reminded us that truth is not a performance. It's a responsibility." The CNN host closed the segment with words now immortalized in editorials and op-eds. This wasn't politics. This was a mirror held up to the Capitol, and what it reflected was not flattering to the establishment. But it was honest. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for permission, she didn't ask for applause, and she sure as hell didn't ask for protection. She walked in with facts, and she walked out with the conscience of the country following her. Then came the final statement, the one that would be screen printed, quoted, and inscribed in high school classrooms from California to Pennsylvania. Not age, not party, but truth and courage defined the Jasmine Crockett moment. The show faded out, but the aftermath didn't. Within hours, CNN's website crashed under the load of video replays. Civic groups updated their invites. Former critics posted reluctant admiration. And in Capitol Hill offices across party lines, aides had one shared thought: this is going to change everything. The Sunday shows rewrote their rundowns to include her name in every segment. By Monday, she'd received 47 interview requests from outlets that had never returned her calls. Students quoted her in debate class. Activists stitched her words onto banners. A small-town newspaper in Nebraska ran the headline, "Crockett teaches the Capitol how to listen." It wasn't about fame. It wasn't a viral moment manufactured for applause. It was a shift, a reorientation of the moral compass in a chamber long adrift. And all of it, every syllable, every breath, every tremor, began with one woman refusing to blink in the face of an empire built to outlast her. But maybe that's exactly why she couldn't be ignored. And yet, as the headlines burned through the airwaves and millions echoed her name, it wasn't the viral metrics or thunderous applause that defined the moment. It was the silence that came after. That deep, resonant silence when America paused just long enough to ask itself, what have we become? And who have we ignored along the way? For Jasmine Crockett, this was never about glory. It was about visibility, the kind that can't be borrowed or staged, the kind you earn by standing when others shrink, by speaking when it's easier to echo. As she walked alone from the Capitol that evening, still gripping the folder she'd weaponized with truth, the streetlights flickered like the last remnants of doubt clearing from a storm. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, because she knew this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. The lesson America learned that day wasn't about one politician's hypocrisy. It was about a structure so desperate to maintain its illusions that it feared its own reflection. Jasmine didn't just reveal duplicity, she exposed the rot hiding behind carefully worded statements, bipartisan shrugs, and polite gaslighting. She tore down the curtain and forced the room to stare at its own shame. And that took something more dangerous than intellect. It took integrity. She didn't come from wealth. She didn't have family connections spanning through DC hallways. What she had, what no system could discredit, was lived truth. Generations of it. The exhaustion in her mother's knees, the resilience in her grandfather's back, the quiet fury of her community, who'd been told for decades that nuance was only a privilege for those who'd already won. Jasmine carried them all into that room, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for clarity. And when clarity came, it didn't shout, it echoed. That's the human lesson buried beneath the headlines and viral reels. That courage isn't noise, it's endurance. That character doesn't come from rising polls. It comes from standing in front of a room full of liars and not flinching when one of them smirks. It comes from being called a recording by a man who's written more flip-flops than laws, and choosing not to scream back, but instead pull out the receipts. It's understanding that silence is power when you've earned the right to break it. And still, Jasmine knew the applause wouldn't last. They would try to claw it back, reshape the narrative, frame her as divisive, say she made things personal. But she also knew truth, once spoken, doesn't go back in the box. It doesn't apologize for its volume. It doesn't fade for comfort. The moral wasn't just for the politicians. It was for the people, for the viewers sitting in living rooms across forgotten counties, for the janitor who's never seen anyone in Congress who looked like him hold a nation still with facts, for the girl in the South Side classroom who, for the first time, Googled the name of a representative, not to mock, but to memorize. What Jasmine Crockett taught the country wasn't how to win a fight, it was how to stand in one. She reminded us that political courage isn't measured in filibusters or fundraising rounds. It's measured in the nights you don't sleep because you're cross-referencing documents alone, knowing no one will thank you. It's when you walk into a press room knowing the jokes are already written, but you walk in anyway, prepared not with slogans, but with truth heavy enough to sink a career if dropped right. She showed that representation isn't about photo shoots. It's about friction. It's what happens when someone uninvited enters a room meant to out-talk them and chooses instead to outlast them. Her voice didn't waver because she knew justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and waits for the world to catch up. But the lesson went deeper. She proved something most of us forget, that democracy isn't protected by those who benefit most from it. It's protected by the ones it keeps trying to push out. Jasmine didn't just disrupt the room. She reminded us that the room was never neutral. It was tilted, built that way. She didn't ask to be equal. She forced the math to prove it couldn't silence her. And that made her dangerous. Because once you strip a lie of its costume, the costume doesn't vanish. It hangs there, limp and humiliated, reminding everyone what they applauded last year. Schumer didn't just lose a debate. He lost the illusion that time equals integrity, that seniority guarantees wisdom, and that labeling someone young and radical is enough to smother the truth they carry. Jasmine Crockett flipped the entire stage by refusing to perform. She didn't raise her voice, but she raised the bar. And that's the most terrifying kind of threat in a world addicted to noise. A quiet, factual one. As night fell on Washington, D.C., and the Capitol lights dimmed, a new kind of clarity settled into the American bloodstream. Not everyone accepted it. Some denied it. Others spun it. But enough people felt it to make it irreversible. You see, the real lesson wasn't in the folder she held. It was in the restraint she carried. The discipline it takes to be right and not rub it in. The emotional gravity to say, I brought the full version. The press can verify. That's not arrogance. That's precision. That's how revolutions start in democracies. Not with weapons, but with words that cannot be retracted. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a mirror. And America, for once, had to look. For every voter who ever said, they don't listen. For every activist arrested while peaceful. For every student told to calm down. For every woman called too much in meetings. For every truth speaker told to wait their turn. Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just televised, it was witnessed. And that's the most radical thing of all. Because when someone with nothing to lose tells the truth, power doesn't just panic, it recalculates. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.